get somebody other best battler of some other town. But he ended up, and I never saw Pete until I was probably in the early 20s, and he was in the hospital. But he ended up being
Yeah.
a floating dredge operator, and he worked all over the country,
This was
or all over the world.
This is your uncle?
Uncle Pete. Uncle Pete worked all over the world as a floating dredge operator, which was at that time, quite an accomplishment. That was these floating dredges he spent a lot of time in the Philippines, South America, and that, mining gold. So these were enormous machines, steam powered. So he battled his way around the world operating these things.
That was your dad's brother.
Yes, well, where he ranked in the order of birth, I don't have any idea. But he was a kind of a short. But anyway, Aunt May, I don't know whether he was a full brother or half brother. I have no idea. And but anyway, Aunt May, when I was in the 3C camp during the 30s, early 30s, what? 30, 33, 34. I stopped and stayed one weekend in Aunt May's, and Pete was in the hospital. We took her up there, and this time he now had became a converted Christian, and he was laying in the bed there, and he was one of these type of people that you don't see anymore, that had done a lot of chewing of tobacco, and he had worn all of his teeth down, and he also had smoked a pipe, and he had a big groove wore right in his teeth that where the pipe stem fit. So he then laying there in bed, and I remember he took my hand and wanted to know if I smoked and if I drank, and of course I lied to him, and well, he thought that was really great because he had never, liquor and tobacco had never crossed his lips. And he went on.
So he was lying to you,
huh? Huh?
He was lying to you?
Well, he was lying to me, but he had been converted and so born again that these things were all erased from his memory. And with Aunt May and I were going back out to the car, she says, he sure did tell a good lie, because he said he spent all the early part of his life smoking and drinking and womanizing. And that's I think the only time I ever saw Uncle Pete, or it was the first and last time I ever saw him. Then there was another brother that my father talked about. I have no idea what his name was. And at the time of the Spanish-American War, he enlisted in the war and went to Cuba or wherever duties assigned him. But never ever saw him again. That was the end of that brother. And Dad talked about the time some little things that happened in Neola, Iowa. Like they used to go down and swim skinny dip down in a little creek that was along the edge of the town of Neola. And some old maid in there was complaining to the constable that these kids were swimming down there naked, and it was just an awful sight. And so I remember Dad said the constable told her to look the other direction and forget about the young kids down there. And then he told me another series of events that he and his brothers and sisters did. And later on, when I was at Northrop. My department clerk was the name of Mrs. Gladding, Millard Gladding, and she was in her probably 60s, and her father had left her an apartment complex up at Paso Robles. Now this was probably in the early 50s, and that's when the interstates were being built all through Colorado, or California, sorry, all through California. And she inherited this apartment complex in Paso Robles, and so she went up there, and they had a caretaker or an overseer or something of this apartment complex, and so that particular party was going to go on vacation for a couple, 3 weeks. So they decided, they arranged for one of the other renters in the apartment to take over the management while they were gone. And they asked Mrs. Gladding and her husband to come up and chat with these people and approve of them. So they went up there, and this particular new overseer's name was Madsen. And they got to, the two ladies got to talking and found out that they were the same, by the fact that her boss's name and the lady's husband's name was Madsen. And so they got to talking about the fact that this Madsen was a surveyor. He was a surveyor on the interstates, and they were traveling from every year or two they would move to another town as the interstate progressed up the length of California. But Mrs. Gladding says, well, where did maybe they're related. She says, where did your husband come from? And she says, well, my husband never talks about his family at all, never talks about it. Other than the fact that I know that he came from someplace in Iowa, and he went to the Spanish-American War from this little town, and he never returned, never ever went back to see them, and never communicated with the family at all. Says he just avoids talking about them. But he says, I know that he had a great time when he was there. And then she recounted the deal about the lady complaining about them swimming nude in the creek, and recounted a whole series of little incidents that my father had related to me. So there was no doubt that he was the long-lost uncle. So Mrs. Gladding came home and recounted all of these things to me. Now, she did not know any of these things, like the swimming. Mm-hmm. And I had never told her that. And so I said, well, my God, that's my long-lost uncle. There's no doubt about that. Well, Mrs. Gladding was really thrilled that she had found my long-lost uncle. I hadn't been looking for him, but in other words, I knew he existed. And so she says, well, I will go up and tell Mrs. Madsen, all about this. And it'd be nice if you could get together. And I said, yeah, I'd like to get together with him. And so anyway, she went up a couple of weeks later to see this Mrs. Madsen up at Paso Robles. And Mrs. Madsen, by that time, had a totally blank memory. She just avoided talking anything about the long-lost nephews and etc. So evidently her husband had informed her that the wife, that if he wanted to know anything about his relatives, he would have long looked them up and just forget the whole thing. So Mrs. Gladding came home and went back to work and told me about she couldn't get her to say anything. And I said, well, that's fine with me if he's happy being the mystery uncle. Well, I would just leave it that way. So I never went up to ever check upon him. So all I know is he ended up being a surveyor. Whether he had any children or anything else, I don't know that.
So your dad had how many brothers and sisters?
That I don't know. He had another side of the family the name was Peterson. And you'll have to get this from Dick McGann. Now, I don't know whether they spelled Peterson with a T or a D. And I don't know whether it was with an O-N or an E-N. I do not know that. I know that when we were younger, in our teens, we visited the Petersons. And that uncle's name was Adolph Peterson. I don't remember the wife's name. They had 2 daughters and a son, and I don't remember any of their names because we never visited with them over a couple, 3 times, as I recall, in my life. And although Mrs. Peterson used to come out when we were living in California, came out a couple of times and stayed at our house.
Where'd they live?
They lived in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Well, they lived in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and then they lived in a little town close, and as I recall, north of Council Bluffs. Iowa's made up of a lot of little towns, about 5 to 7 miles apart. In any direction, there's another town. And I don't remember what the name of that town was. But
Well, you know, I'm recording this. Let's. I didn't get your dad and all that history that you were covering with your dad. Let's go back and.
What history?
Well, his parents coming from Denmark.
Oh.
How they got together.
They were both had been married before, lost their mates.
Your grandparents.
My grandparents.
This was in Denmark.
This was my paternal grandparents. This was in Denmark. They came from the town of Aalborg, spelt with a double A, L-B-O-R-G. It's one of the major seaports of Denmark. And grandfather's family were professionals. They were, I think, barristers or whatever. They were in the law. And
Do you remember his name?
no, don't have any idea. Out of grandmother's when Dean died, we received a bunch of funeral notices from Loretta.
I don't know what that is.
And I remember they were all held together with a paper clip.
I think they're in with the old photographs somewhere.
And are those available?
I don't know.
They,
Right now, I don't know anything else.
But anyway, grandfather's parents were professionals. Grandmother was a domestic. And in Denmark at that time, there was a great class distinction. But Grandma came to the grandfather was staying at his parents' homes with his children. I don't know how many with those. And then Grandma came as a domestic and brought her children and stayed at the home. And so then they fell in love and married, and that was a kind of a no-no socially. So then they came to America. And my father was the first one born, and he was born in Neola, Iowa. And then that was followed.
And where in Neola?
Neola, N-E-O-L-A, just outside of the town of Council Bluffs. And And then that was followed by another child by the name of Charlie, or Charles. And grandfather worked as a section foreman for the Milwaukee Railroad. And I did not know. I can remember meeting both of those grandparents, but I was about 4 or 5 years old, and they both died at about relatively close together, at again about that same age. Dad was a railroader, station agent on the railroad, and he quit.
Did he work for the Milwaukee?
And worked for the Milwaukee Railroad, and he quit the railroad, and he and his brother Charlie, decided to become farmers. And Uncle Charlie was a irresponsible young unattached male at that time, and was not really too reliable, and was anything but a farmer. And so that deal went bottoms up. That was close to Council Bluffs, Iowa. And I remember we lived in a big old home, had big barns, and a lot of timberland, a lot of cultivated land.
You disappeared out of there.
Well, I don't have any idea why I disappeared out of there. Put it on your coffee cup.
Well, I wanted to drink my coffee cup.
Well,
That's all right. I'll get
Here.
it. Yeah, that's a good one.
So, anyhow, where were we? That's where I started. No,
Teresa.
Yeah.
I started going to school in a little town called Teeds Grove, Iowa. And then we moved from Teeds Grove, Iowa to the farm. And then at the farm, I then went to a little country school. Again, this was one of the historic old schools where one teacher taught all 8 grades. The room was divided into 2 rooms, and I think they went from the 1st to the 4th grade was in one half of the school, and then the 5th to the 8th was in the other one, or maybe it was 1 to the 3rd and 4th to the 8th. I don't remember, but anyway, you sat at your desk, so-called studying your lessons, and then while the other classes were up reciting theirs, and in some ways that was not too bad because you kind of knew where you were going and what you were going to be studying, and sometimes that was more interesting to listen to them recite their lessons than it was studying your own. So that taught me to be a kind of a dawdler as far as studying.
Is that you?
That is me, and that's one of Mother's brothers, Uncle Charlie, and his aunt, and his wife, Annie. And I don't know, I had been traveling for Northrop, and I stopped by Cheyenne and went out to visit them on their farm in Carpenter, Wyoming. And he took and passed that picture around. They took and passed that picture around and told everybody, looked at that, and Charlie was a very fun-loving man, and he told everybody that was President Kennedy, John Kennedy, who had been out to see him about the farm policy.
Right up there, let's see. Yeah.
And so he said that was John Kennedy, and he had told him what was wrong with the subsidies and what the things were going to be.
Here's a bunch you might like.
And he
We'll go
was,
through these later. Yeah.
Okay,
That's fine. We'll just
he was,
come up here.
well,
he was one of the places that we visited a lot, and they had 4 kids. They had Mabel, and gosh, I got to. And they had another one called Snooks. That was a nickname. I can't right now recall. I never knew him by anything other than Snooks. And then they had another younger brother. And I probably mentioned Mabel. Mabel's still living over in Boise, Idaho. Mabel is one of my favorite cousins. She was always a lot of fun. Quite a tomboy. She could always outrun you, out-wrestle you. And, it was just a lot of fun.
I have never seen some of these.
You never had?
Some of them I have, and I haven't seen them.
But anyhow, I don't know where we diverted. I was going to one of the famous country schools, 8th grades in it. And my brother Dean graduated from the 8th grade in a little country school in town that existed just outside of Council Bluffs, just east of Council Bluffs, called Weston, Iowa.
So your grandparents both came over here, and then they died while you were still quite young.
Well, when I was about 4 or 5, yeah. That's when we lived out on the farm that Charlie and Dad started. That was a kind of a disaster. It just financial disaster.
That was a different Charlie than what we just saw.
That was Charlie on my father's side. The Charlie you just saw in the photo was Charlie on my mother's side.
Right.
So it was